I'd like to thank you for taking the time to share with me some of the slides I took in historic Western occupied Armenia. But before I take you to that destination that I had in 1969, I'd like to explain what took me to Armenia, historic Armenia. In 1968, my wife Rose and I went to then Soviet Armenia for the first time. She had learned that her mother's sister had survived the genocide and was living in Armenia, in Soviet Armenia. When we arrived in Moscow, one of the Russian policemen asked me what country I was from. We were in the Kremlin area, the Red Square, and I told him from Armenia and Armenian birth, and that we were from America, and I wanted to visit Armenia for the first time. And he said, well, you must go there. The Armenians helped us fight the Nazis. And while you're here, you must go to the Armenian Ararat restaurant. So as Rose and I returned to the Metropole Hotel where we were staying, I said, let's go. Let's go to the restaurant. On our way, we were waiting for the elevator to take us to the main floor. We met, by chance, a small world, Hamayag Kachadurian. Hamayag was a displaced person who came to America after World War II. My mother and father were working for Ansha then to help displaced Armenians. His first night in America was at our home in Detroit. I told Hamayag where I was going, and he said, well, you have to, on your return, please stop in my room, and we'll have some Armenian cognac and find out what's happening. On our return to the hotel after a nice evening with fellow Armenians in Moscow, I visited with Hamayag and his wife and a little old lady in his room. And as we were talking, I was speaking to Hamayag in English, and my wife, who speaks good, fluent Armenian, Mushetsi dialect, was conversing with her friends. And the little old lady turned to my wife and said, Amusinit Haya or Odar. And I turned to her and I said, Maidiges Hayam, Harutogos Haya. Maides Erzumsia, Yev Haides Karetsia. But she leaned forward and said, what village was your father from? I said, Khopes. And this little old lady jumped out of the couch, grabbed me, kissed me, says, my son, I am from Khopes too. What was your father's name? I told her it was Kaspar, but she didn't place it, couldn't remember the name. But she told me an interesting story that eventually got me here. She told me that when her two brothers left Turkey after World War II, they were allowed to repatriate to Soviet Armenia, along with a lot of other repatriates. They stopped in the Khopes village for the last time to view the Derderian home. Mariam was born and raised in Khopes, and the Derderian home was a large home. And she says, and I said, well, why is that important for me? She said, well, let me explain. My brothers said that Panatim Kehetian still lives. She survived the genocide, and she's living in that village. I recorded that information and thought, well, when I get back to Armenia, visit Armenia, and then from there we'll go back to America, I'll confront my uncle Mesrop in Detroit. She said that Panatim Kehetian still lives, and I told her my uncle Mesrop, and she remembered Mesrop. She remembered the home. My uncle Mesrop's father was a physician, and she had broken her arm falling off of a donkey, and she went to my uncle's home, and his father repaired her arm. And she remembers that, falling off the donkey and going to the doctor's home. So with that information, I logged it into my little diary. And being a newspaper man, I always carry a notebook. So when we returned to America after 2 weeks in Armenia, Rose meeting with her cousins, I had no cousins in Armenia. And I kept looking across the border to Ottoman, knowing that out there in that hinterland was my heritage. When we returned to Detroit, I went to see Uncle Meslo. Took him a bottle of cognac from Armenia. And I explained to him about my visit and how nice it was being with all the Armenians. And then I told him, I said, Uncle, I have an interesting story. I met this woman, an old lady, Madame Detroiter, and I told about falling off the donkey, breaking her arm, going to his house, and how his father fixed her arm. And he looked at me, he said, I remember her. I remember the Detroiters. They had a big home. I remember very well. I said, well, she had a real interesting story. Let me ask, who was Memoir Kehetian? He said, Memoir Kehetian? He said, that was your father's sister. I said, what? He said, yes, that was your father's sister. Why? I said, well, she says, and I explained how her two brothers saw Memoir before repatriating to Armenia, Soviet Armenia. And he said, that's impossible. You bring me news from the grave. She died. The Turks killed her in 1923. We got a letter from Istanbul that she had been killed trying to escape. That night I said, I've got to find out more. And it bothered me. It was troublesome. Why would my uncle tell me anything different? So the next day I went to see my aunt, Hrayr Toukhanian, also from Hopes. Hrayr saw my aunt Memoir for the last time when they were trying to flee from the Turkish soldiers. And Hrayr said, Mushech, that's my Armenian name, you have to go and find out for sure. After all these years, she might still be living. I wrote about this interesting story, to me it was, in my newspaper that I worked at. 2 days later, Congressman Nedzi called me from Detroit, a well-known congressman at that time. He said, Mitch, are you going to Armenia, to Turkish Armenia? And I said, Congressman, how would I even find her? I can't speak Turkish. My Armenian is limited. How can I find her? And he said, look, you get all the information about her, the family history. I'll put the State Department to work and we'll find her. I said, and they did. After 1 year, I got the news that yes, she lived, she survived, but she had just died 6 years earlier from natural causes and had a son and daughter still living. And with that, I decided I was going off to Turkish Armenia with the help of Congressman Nedzi and State Department Director Brendan Rogers, who helped me. And now I will talk to you about those slides. I share these slides twice the size of what you're going to see today as I travel across America and Canada, sharing these with fellow Armenians. Of my visit, not only the Hoof, but the Sebastia, Mush, Van, Bitlis, Erzurum, Sebastia, Carpet. But today, I want to limit with the showing of these slides, condense them to about 50 or more, with the help of Hrayr Toukhanian, my friend here in Detroit, who is himself a photographer and film director. And he told me, Mitch, you have to share this with the people. While these slides are still good and available, we'll do it. And with his help, you're about to see what I saw. And believe me, it's not a tourist film. The slides you see represent what happened to Turkish Armenia. When folks saw my slides across the country, they wanted to see big buildings. I said, there aren't any left. In all the Armenian cities and villages, they're destroyed. There is no Armenian left. It's a graveyard without gravestones. So I thank you for taking the time to share with me, and I hope that it interests you enough to continue the cause for the Armenian justice we all seek. In our first stop, we're in Sebastia, an old Armenian city that is now heavily populated by Turks and Kurds, mostly Turks. And when we arrived in Sebastia, my guide, who was Turkish, and my driver and bodyguard was Kurdish, they inquired about Armenian life in Sebastia. I told them it was once a large Armenian community. Well, we found that there were some Armenians, about 500, and that 3 of them, locally, down the street from where we were having lunch, were of Armenian descent and ran a linen shop and a jewelry shop. And turned out it was Savak, Manuk, and Torkom. And when we met, and we had some coffee, surge, and I asked them about their families. And they said they raised their children, they sent them to Istanbul, to the AGBU schools for support, where they remain Armenian and don't lose their language and remain Armenian Christians. But there's no future for Christian Armenians in the interior. I thought it was commendable that these men send their children off to retain their identity. Something that we can all learn from here in the diaspora. When we reached the outskirts of Sebastia in a neighboring village, which was part of Sebastia, they said, this is where the Armenians lived, mostly by the water. At that time, it was in July and the water was dry, as you can see. The mountains further back, way in the back, you can see some snow up there. But this is where Armenians live, now occupied by Kurds. And I kind of remembered stories of my friends from Detroit, the Sepastatis, how proud they were of being of Sepastia heritage. And as I left Sebastia, I realized that I know more Sepastatis in Detroit than in the historic town of Sebastia. This was the first part of the sad journey that I was about to embark on. Here was another, as we were leaving Sebastia, we viewed some more sections, and I looked back for the last time. And here we're passing the bank, now a bank, Turkish bank, in Sebastia. You can see what the traffic is like. And now we're headed towards Erzincan and Erzurum, driving through the Manzur Mountains of Western Armenia. And it was a sight to behold. I was just awed by the beauty of it, and now occupied by Turks and Kurds. When we reached Askakeli, I turned to my guide, Mehmet, and I said, Mehmet, there's a story about this that even goes back beyond the genocide. During World War II, the Turkish government, modern-day Turkey, America's ally, decided to tax all Armenians and Jews in Istanbul, the merchants, a business tax, really a war tax. If you couldn't pay the war tax, they shipped you to Askakeli on the outskirts of Erzurum for forced labor, to force money from you. A lot of Armenians were sent to Askakeli that I learned about. Some of them never returned to Istanbul. So those who say the genocide was many, many years ago, as late as World War II, the Turks continued their form of genocide against Armenians and Jews. As we arrived in beautiful Erzurum, as my mother used to talk about, the wheat fields on the outskirts of the city, the black mountains, I knew right away this was Erzurum. And Mehmet said, how do you know? I said, my mother used to tell me about the wheat field, the golden wheat fields of Erzurum. And sure enough, they were still there, now enjoyed by the Turks. And as we drove through the city, I saw the signs leading to Mount Ararat, Kars, Mus, which is Mush for Armenia. And that's where my wife's family was from. And as we were preparing to leave Erzurum, I realized I was the only Armenian still living in Erzurum. I was the only person who could say, I'm Armenian, because we couldn't find any people who knew they were Armenian. They were told they lived in the outskirts. My mother used to talk to me about the Roman castle built by her home in Erzurum. How as a child she played there. And here is a story I must share with you. This picture taken in front of the train station in Erzurum. From here the trains take you to Kars and to Soviet Armenia. Why would I take a picture? I couldn't get inside the station. And my guide wanted to know, why is this so important? And I told him that there was a little old lady in Detroit, Alexei Kasparian, who told me about the train station, that her father's gravestone, along with other Armenian gravestones, were used to fortify the floor of the station. I told that to my guide, and he said, Mr. Kehetian, we Turks, why do you think we Turks would steal from your own graves? I said, please, go inquire, since I can't go in there with my camera. Mehmet returned in a few minutes. He said, what that old lady told you is true, but you can't take any pictures on the inside. And anyway, the gravestones are covered with poured concrete. And what did you Armenians expect? For us to take care of your graveyards? With that, I didn't argue anymore. It was sad. This is what happened to Armenia. This is what happened to the genocide. So those who say, forget what happened, how can we forget? I'm now at Hinas, just on the outskirts of Erzurum. There's Mehmet with me and some children who came from the village of Hinas, over the hilltop. The children were elated to see me, and I gave them some candy. And soon their parents were coming across from the village. They wanted to know what the commotion was. And my guide explained to them. Actually, it was more my bodyguard who spoke to them in fluent Kurdish. Who I was, why I was there, and that I was an Armenian. And right away they said, oh, Ermania, which is Armenian in Turkish and Kurdish. But I noticed that the children and the people, the men, they didn't look Turkish. They didn't look Kurdish. They even looked Armenian. Some resembled Armenian caricatures. And I asked them how they knew about the Armenians. They said, before the Armenians left, during the Great War, meaning World War I, the Armenians used to say that God came and talked with St. Gregory, the Armenian saint, and they drank water from this spring here. And I'll never forget that. And as we turned, I looked and saw the fading of the skies over Erzurum, and now I was on the plains of Mush, the Mush Mountains, the Gurung, famous Gurung of Mush, crossing the Murad Khed, the Murad River, headed towards Mush. I was now going to where my wife's family was from. Here was an old Armenian church covered with debris and dirt. Just left there, rot away. Finding in the village of Sokhom, where my late father-in-law Mesrop was from, and straight ahead, his father's home. And then the village of Mush, with the church buildings still standing. The local people would show us where the church buildings were. Or walking through Erzurum, and then walking now through Mush, and seeing Armenian structures, as you can see to the right, the curvatures of the buildings, and the snow in the mountains. This is what's left of Mush, where the Armenians once lived, where they fought and died. I'll never forget this visit. This is where my family's ancestry, the roots, come from. And now it was on to look for her village of Sokon and for Maranik, where her mother was from. Crossing the Murad River again and looking back and wondering if I'll ever come back here. Chances are I won't, but it was one more look at where my wife's roots are from. And looking at the Murad River, now quiet and serene, once filled with the corpses of Armenians, as reported. And looking at the old Armenian church buildings, as you can see, the archways were different, curvature. And when I stood in there with the beam still holding the roof and wondering how many people came here to pray and how many died fighting to protect us, or finding the missionary school with the inscription in Armenian that was whitewashed, but you could still see the Armenian inscription, and finding Hagop, the butcher. He was the only Armenian, but he's now a Muslim. He said, when I die, we all die. Mush dies. And finding this old gentleman in Norsha, and how he and his sons are also Muslim. It's the only way they could survive. And then moving on to Van, and we reached Lake Van, the port city of Tatvan. Looking out at the Van Lake, my Vanity friends in Detroit would love this, to go bathing in that water. And I thought of them all. And looking out at the beautiful water of Lake Van, only a major saltwater lake, also the death place for Armenians. And moving on to Bitlis, where William Saroyan staked claim of his roots, and looking at the Bitlis as it is today. We couldn't find any Armenians. They were told there were some out in the villages. And that was always the story. And yet I found Bitlis to be so picturesque, so beautiful. And then looking ahead as we were about to leave, the fortress, the Bitlis Pass at the top, goes back into ancient times. And the spring water running through the town, how picturesque it would be, where Armenians once lived, sang and danced. And now I was getting closer and closer to my destination, the Hrayr River, the western tributary of the Euphrates River, as we moved along the roadway up in the mountains of Hrayr, and wondering how many of the Armenians died in those rivers. And coming upon Hrayr, this is the destination, where it all started, because of a lady in Moscow. And finding the mountains of Hrayr exciting, and yet I could see why they survived, where the Hittite Empire once ruled. And today, Mount Sulbu straight ahead, that Armenians cherish, Kehetian Armenians. And now as I was leaving Hrayr, we were headed towards Hoops. I wondered about the future. And I found my father's village, the Subkarabet church in ruins, still laying there, toppled over. And finding the cornerstone, as you can see the inscription on the cornerstone, Mesrop Apkarian. My uncle Mesrop told me Mesrop Apkarian built the church. And when my cousin Hussein and I went up to the hilltop to pray at my aunt's gravesite, overlooking the Euphrates River, and then finding where her home was, and her son Hussein, who built a wooden gate and rocks for the gateways, and then finding both of them, my cousin and my cousin Elif. And then as I left, I saw this beautiful view of Hogas also in Kehri, a close village. And then moving on, as we headed towards the end of the journey, Carpet, the Supkarovit church, walls still standing. And if I may take a time to explain who this man is. In my memoir, which I titled Giants of the Earth, friends of mine asked, why did you give that name, Giants of the Earth? And I said, well, the Armenians I found, or who knew they were Armenian, had survived. They didn't lose their identity. They weren't afraid to speak up. They were proud of their Armenian. But especially Hachig Hovhannisyan. Hachig was from the village of Hoshkar. His mother and father, his brothers and sisters were killed by the Turks. He ran out into the woods to escape. And after 2-3 days of hunger, he was returning to the home. And he was stopped by the Kurdish farmer, a friend of his father. He said, you can't go in there. But he ran in and found them all with their throats cut, dead. The Kurdish farmer buried them in the field and took care of Hachig, but never to lose his identity. Now, the reason I mentioned Hachig, I was visiting with the editor of the Bengal Gazette, where we're standing at, who was Kurdish. And he told me, he said, we have an Armenian in Bengal. Would you like to meet him? I said, you know of the one Armenian? Yes. And they sent for him. We had some coffee. And soon this old man with raggedy clothes come walking in, and he wanted to, Haya. And I said, Heidi, yes, Chaim. He didn't believe me at first. And I told him that my parents were from Erzurum and Khubs. And then we talked some more. And finally he agreed to talk with me. I asked him about his family, and he told me the story. But I asked him, how did you retain your Armenian language? It wasn't perfect, but he could still speak it. He said, by the prayers. He prayed every night and would go and talk to his parents and his brothers and sisters at their grave sites. I said, well, what about your family? Do you have a family now? He said, no. If I did marry, I'd have to marry a Muslim. And I wasn't going to change my faith. When I die, I want to go to heaven and be with my family. That's why I don't have a family. To me, Hachig Hovhannisyan is truly the giant of the earth. And I'll never forget this man and hope to meet him someday. And finally, as we approach the end, I closed with Hachig Hovhannisyan, the giant of the earth who survived and kept his faith, and told me, when you go back to your city, burn a candle for me, light a candle, and let your Supsakis church know that Hachig Hovhannisyan has not lost his faith. This slide is in present-day Armenia, now a free republic. But this was in 1970 when I took this picture. These were the children from Sardarabad village, where the Armenians fought and won their major victory to stop the Turks who were trying to capture what was left of Armenia. They died by the hundreds against the Turkish army, but at Sardarabad, at Karakilis, they won. In Bashaparan, the Armenians fought. But it was here at Sardarabad that they saved Echmiadzin. And that's why these children are the future. Today, they are now probably parents and have children of their own. But those who say the Armenians vanished, no, we survived. And that's why we fought, and that's why they fought at Sardarabad. And that's why we, as Armenians in the diaspora, can never forget. We must never forget. If we do, then shame on all of us. And thank you for taking the time to share this with me, and I hope I have passed on some of my feeling about why our heritage is priceless. Thank you.